So, yeah, the last week, basically, when we started, it was sort of frustrating because we were trying to let everybody know how to navigate the forums. And what we started to figure out was that some of the changes that we've been talking about for a while, um, weren't completely implemented. And so the video last week allowed us to kind of review that. And then April and Lori Walsh from customer service went through that and then kind of cleaned everything up. And so somebody's asking, where's April? Unfortunately, here, April, if you want to go ahead and say hi, I'll show my phone so people can kind of see you. I don't know if they'll see
Hi,
you.
everybody.
So that's April. She's a really real live person. So what I wanted to talk to is, so April and I, along with basically 6 other coaches, walk clients through their group coaching journals. And so lately we've been doing assessments because we brought on a bunch of group coaching clients. And I would say that probably 50% of what we talk about is not food related, right? It's really how you work out. Would you say that that's pretty close for you too as well?
Yes, absolutely.
And so what I thought was that I was trying to think about what would the second episode be of getting started. And realistically, I think that talking about how you work out is where we should have the second one, because we can talk about your activity level, we can talk about your MyFitnessPal and go through all these various things, right? But if you've been weightlifting for 3 years and kind of stuck with the same results, or if you've been doing CrossFit as an example for 2 years and you haven't seen any results, then we can sort of walk you through what might be a better approach. Does that seem like a reasonable idea for you, April?
That sounds great, but you threw me for a loop again because I was all ready to talk about my fitness pal.
Well, I was thinking about that because as much as I would like to talk about MyFitnessPal, truthfully, unless we can kind of navigate MyFitnessPal in real time, I don't know how helpful that's going to be, nor do I think that's going to be near as helpful as what we're going to talk about right now.
I agree, and we can probably add that in with another topic, maybe next week or the week after.
Right, and or we could make some videos or something of that nature on the YouTube channel, which I don't know if a lot of people know this, but this is actually recorded on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/eat2perform. So if you want to watch all 150 webinars, you're certainly welcome to. But we tend to talk about similar ideas. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was sort of like this idea of how you become a better athlete, right? Because the whole idea with Eat to Perform is that your performance is first. And so when performance is first, what we're really going to be looking at is making sure that you're eating an adequate amount of food. And so if you're brand new to Eat to Perform, what we do is we sort of write out a plan for you, and then the moderators and coaches then email you that plan. And so once you have that plan, they'll give you your macros, what your protein, carbohydrates, and your fat should look like, kind of a general ballpark. What we tend to ask people is where you came from. And so we like to have people estimate. A lot of people don't always know, but they can kind of come up with a good ballpark. And so once we have that ballpark, then we'll gradually move them to where their body would rather be. And for some people, that takes a while. If you've been dieting since you were 15 years old and you're now 47, it might take you a little bit longer than someone who's a little bit younger, hasn't dieted near as much, and then potentially, from my experience, the better athletes tend to respond to it better. What are your thoughts on that, April?
Absolutely, 1000% agree. Generally, someone with a better work capacity, a better athlete in general, will usually adjust to the higher calories fairly quickly.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting to me that everyone seems to want to go to the less model, really quickly, right? And then um, they don't really want to explore that expansion of work capacity. And so, what I really wanted to talk about was how do you expand your work capacity, and I'm going to start with something like you know uh, CrossFit, right? So let's say that you're doing CrossFit, or maybe you walked in and you're doing some level of boot camp, something like that, right? What you're really trying to do is up your general physical preparedness, right? And so what you're trying to establish is a baseline of athleticism. And so we're going to walk you through a little bit of how you would do that. Taking those elements out of the mix, right? And so you can have, high intensity or circuits or something like that in the mix, but we're going to give you some thoughts on all of these things so you can then go, oh, I can sort of see, what we often see is people that weight lift tend to want to weight lift too much. People that want to run tend to run too much. People that CrossFit too much. And so what we're the main emphasis that we're going to go into is rest and recovery, because without rest and recovery, you're going to be working out um, at 60% a lot. And so the way that we think about it is if we can get you working out at 100%, the good majority of the time, obviously that's the best formula for getting a better athlete, more active metabolism. Obviously there's a food component, so you can, eat a little bit more flexibly and things of that nature. So let's start with weightlifting. Okay. So one of the things that I think happens for a lot of new people as it relates to weightlifting is they don't push the weights up higher. Okay. And so as an example, they'll go in, they'll get some type of sets and reps routine, and then they'll feel like they worked out, right? But in general, they don't have a progressive routine that allows them to get stronger. And so I'm going to talk at first about getting stronger. And then the second part, I'll start talking about building muscle and how you do that. Any thoughts on that before we jump in, April?
I'm just listening.
Well,
I'm agreeing so far.
I mean, you're probably the best example of, you probably been doing this longer than I've done it from the standpoint of, sets and reps. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that, I'm not like the end all be all authority on this. Most of my training has been more powerlifting focused, CrossFit focused, things of this nature, whereas you've been kind of doing sets and reps and things of that nature for a while. What is your current 1 rep max for deadlifts and stuff?
My deadlift is 270. My squat is weak. I just hit 200, and my bench is 145.
That's pretty good. Yeah, what's interesting about when we start talking about 1 rep maxes, because that's something that people are really interested in, and I see this a lot, in CrossFit gyms, where people get really fascinated with 1 rep maxes. And I think that most people would be better off, especially new people, with 3 to 5 rep maxes. And April is shaking her head.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Yeah, so so when we talk about, somebody that's just new and just slapping 5 pounds on the bar and they just adapt to that, as they go, what I think happens for a lot of folks is they come from an atmosphere where they weren't doing very much, and then they want to look like dive headfirst, into doing a whole bunch of stuff. And oftentimes they won't, you know, have the food component right. We'll talk about the food component more. Obviously, if you want to go check the Eat to Perform calculator, you're more than welcome to do so. That would be helpful for a lot of people, because I think what a lot of people don't understand is the amount of food that it takes to adapt to current stimulus. And so for you to adapt and get better, ultimately food needs to be part of that process. In the beginning, you can sort of get away with less food, right? But as you become a better athlete over time, not only do you need more food, like for instance, one of the things that we find is that when you're weightlifting, or let's say that you're really pushing the upper capacity of your long endurance, something of that nature, um, and you look at your activity tracker like a Fitbit or something like that, and you see that, it says I'm supposed to eat 3,500. I would actually argue that you need to eat more than that, because what is going to happen is you want your body to be able to adapt to the stress, right? And so not only do you need an adequate amount of food, but you actually need an extra amount of food, because what we're really trying to do is replace fat tissue with lean muscle tissue. And so for you to create lean muscle tissue, not only do you have to have, an adequate amount of food that you would normally eat, but you possibly need a little bit more than that. Now, should you be constantly pushing that? I would argue you shouldn't, right? Because what happens for most people is, and once again, if you're brand new to all this stuff, you can get away with a lot of adaptation. Like as an example, when people start CrossFitting, they start using muscles they haven't used for years, and they progress insanely, from an athlete standpoint. They don't always progress from a weight loss standpoint. There's a couple reasons for that. Obviously, they're, adding some muscle. But if the food component isn't correct, then we start looking at a stress component, right? So then you go, well, how do I get strong? Well, in the beginning, you pretty much just do anything and you keep adding weight to the bar and you'll get stronger. But I would say within 6 months to a year, you need sort of a progressive approach. And I think that something like Windler 531 or Strong Lifts 5x5, those are great programs for people that are just starting off. We actually have a higher volume set that Chad Wesley Smith from Juggernaut Training wrote for us. And it basically takes you from, I'm currently doing the 10s, 8s, and 5s. And the reason why I'm doing 10s, 8s, and 5s is because I'm a little more focused on muscle building. And so right now, when you're trying to build muscle, you want to have more rest, and then more reps, right? And so when you are trying to strictly get stronger, your reps would typically decrease. So like April was talking about, her, 270-pound deadlift, I think that if you were doing like 3s, 2s, and 1s, she'd be operating much closer to 90 and 95%, right? But at 10s, 8s, and 5s, she's really going to be focused more around like 45% to 70%. And so that's how you kind of swing it a little bit. And both, both are fine. It's just a matter of what your goals are for that given moment. And there are no shortage of strength building protocols and muscle building protocols. right? The strength part is fairly easy. The muscle part, I would say, is a little bit more difficult. And so before we move on to that, I just wanted to ask April's opinion on, what she thinks about my thoughts related to strength building.
I agree. I'm curious, the 10, 8, 5s, the 10s, 8s, and 5s, what percentages do you use for that?
The 10s was 45, 55, and 65. The 8s was 50, 60, 70, and then I'm assuming that next week is going to be 55, 65, and 70. Yeah, 50, 55, 65, 75. So not that high. And what you're really doing in that instance, because I was talking to someone, and this is actually really interesting for people because one of the things that we hear a lot from folks is, I got stronger, so therefore I added more muscle. You did not. Almost always you did not. You are essentially training your central nervous system to handle heavy loads, right? So your body's capabilities to deal with that stress has changed, and therefore you can now lift more weight. As an example, the good majority of people can lift a lot more weight than they believe that they can lift. But let's walk through the process. Okay, so I'm deadlifting, and my hamstrings are able to lift 450. My glutes are able to lift 450, but my lats are only able to lift 300. Guess what? I'm lifting 300, right? And so as I start to train my central nervous system and start to build some of these parts of my body, then I start to get a little bit stronger. But I think I'm not saying that you can't build muscle. I'm not going to say that it's not favorable. In fact, it is very favorable, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second here. But I just kind of wanted to dispel the myth that just because you get stronger, that you gain muscle. And you've maybe changed what that muscle can do, changed it, to fast twitch fiber and things of that nature, and you made it more useful. But it really is kind of that, training of the central nervous system. That's a big thing. And I wanted to bring that point up because I think it's kind of important. What are your thoughts on that, April?
I agree. That's generally like with my training, because my goal is I want to get stronger, but I also want to look good. And I want to gain muscle. So generally with the heavy compounds, I focus on getting stronger, but I add in a lot of volume for everything else, or I might add in volume for, the compound stuff, but that's a much lower percentage, of my maxes. So, because I do think that that's important.
Yeah, the other thing in terms of strength, if, for instance, you're a CrossFitter, strength endurance is actually as important as strength, right? So to be able to do some of these routines, one of the things that's sort of interesting about the better athletes and the better athletes that have overall condition, or have better general physical preparedness, the better athletes in general can operate much closer to their 1 rep max. So I'll fully admit I'm not that good at CrossFit. But I can deadlift, close to 500 pounds. So there's a number of people that if we were deadlifting 315 pounds for reps, I have to use more of my body, to pull a heavy weight, right? For a better athlete, they don't have to use, they can rely on various energy systems better than I can, right? And so they might be able to pull that 315 much faster than I can related to strength endurance, but they might not be as strong as I am on a 1 rep max, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah. So what I want to talk, and obviously we're sort of running through this a little bit, and then hopefully I'll kind of tie it up in the end. In terms of muscle building, what is interesting for a lot of people that are, new to training, one, if you haven't done anything, you'll see a lot of progress. But once again, once you hit that 6 month to a year window, then some of that progress starts to stall. And then you go, well, okay, now what do I do? Well, you have to get a little bit more specific. And if you remember early on, there wasn't a lot of ego involved. You weren't necessarily always trying to lift the most weights in the gym, or in the case of CrossFit, trying to RX a WOD. So what those folks will do is they'll start to put like an expectation on their workouts, and it won't necessarily be complementary. So like as an example, when I talk about, right now, the numbers that I'm using are 460 at 45, 55, and 65. Now, I could have started that at 500 pounds, right? And then gone into this cycle where I would be stressing my system out right off the bat. But what I wanted to do was gradually move myself into kind of these heavier weights for higher reps, because the big concern obviously is always form. I mean, even at, 65% of 500 pounds, that's still fairly significant for 10 reps. And so you want to make sure that you're strong enough to be able to handle that load. And so what I think the mistake that a lot of people make with hypertrophy work is they don't have enough muscle activation. And so when you think about muscle activation, we have a great video from Mr. MyoReps, Borj Fajarli, and what he talks about is that at the upper 1 rep max attempts, your fiber engagement is really, really strong. And so one of the reasons why I'm fairly strong is because I've learned to have more fiber engagement for my 1 rep maxes. Okay, then you go, but how do I get fiber engagement so I can see enough muscle adaptation? So like, for instance, on my 1 rep max attempts, I'll have a lot of fiber engagement, just not enough work in place to create new tissue, right? So what you do, or at least one of the things that I do, and it's fairly common with a pyramid scheme type stuff, is you will work up to heavier sets, heavy-ish sets being 80 to 90%, and then you'll drop set or down set, right? And so you can drop set, and I always get the two mixed up, and so I apologize for that, but drop setting would be going from, let's say, 90% to say 60%, where you're a lot more comfortable. Now, you will not see fiber engagement at 60% until you start to get into the higher reps, right? And so, for instance, let's say that your 1 rep max for bench press is 200 pounds, and then you go to 60%, that's at 120 pounds. It might take you 12 reps to get to the kind of fiber engagement that will allow for muscle building, right? And so you've got to kind of work through that. And there's various ways to do that. Like I said, down set, drop setting. Rest is a big component to this. I'll just give you the basic ideas of MyoReps as an example. So MyoReps would be, you would take a weight, let's say 50 to 60%. You would do them at failure or near failure, okay? And sort of depending on the amount of weight would depend on the amount of rest. And so as an example, let's say that you are at 60% and you're at 120. So for myself, if I was doing 120, I wouldn't need 30 seconds of rest for that. So I would probably be able to bang out something like 25 reps, maybe 20, 25 reps, something like that. Then you come back and within 15 seconds, you then hit 4 reps, okay? And then in another 15 seconds, then you hit 3 reps, and then you go 2, 2, 2, until essentially your muscles want to pop out of your skin, right? And so that's what I think a lot of people are sort of missing from a hypertrophy standpoint, is they aren't getting to that point. And so they go, well, should I feel sore the next day? I wouldn't say that feeling sore the next day is near as important as feeling like you've reached that lactate threshold where your muscles kind of feel the burn, right? Is there any other way that you would say that better, April?
No, I think you said it. I think you said it pretty well. It kind of made me smile. Basically, until you start, turning into the Hulk, you did it right when you said your muscles are basically just bulging, and that's pretty much about it.
And veins start to pop out of your shoulder and things like this, and then like literally 30 minutes later, you're like, what happened to that guy? But then obviously what you want to do is you want to eat an adequate amount of food so you can hold on to, because what you're essentially doing is you're breaking down tissue in an effort to build up stronger and better and more useful tissue. And so if you don't eat an adequate amount of food, see, this is the problem with the people that are trying to keep their calories low, stay lean. We often talk about being bloated in this instance, and I'm gonna go ahead and talk about bloated right now because and then I'm gonna actually sort of move into kind of like long endurance, but this would be a bridge because I can talk about both of them. So you're doing your hypertrophy work. I would say that if you had an excessive amount of carbohydrates and you were doing something like strength training, but you didn't do a lot of accessory work or you didn't do a lot of hypertrophy training, you might feel a little bit more bloated. And I'm not saying that you won't feel bloated after this as well, but if you look at the 2 ways that you can sort of soak up the nutrients the best, it's going to be the most volume, right, for the amount of work that you're trying to do. So now all of a sudden you do a lot of work, you have some creatine, you have some rice, your body is more likely to soak that up given the amount of work that you were doing. So for instance, if you were strength training doing 1, 2, or 3 reps, your body's not going to soak up those nutrients the way that it would doing 200 reps, right? And you go, well, 200 reps, that sounds crazy. Well, it's not, because we're talking about things like single-legged lunges, or yesterday I was doing ab wheel rollouts. I think when you added it up, all of my reps were in the hundreds or 200s, right? And so you go, well, with that kind of volume, you're really not going to see a lot of bloating unless you really super overeat. You know what I'm saying? So let's say that you would normally need 3,000 calories and you ate 3,500 calories. Your body would soak that up really well, especially if you were having a lot of carbohydrates. But if you were to eat, let's say 6,000, 7,000 calories, but you'd only burn 3,000 calories that day, well, certainly you would see some bloating. There, of course, are many factors that go on here. For women, time of month is going to be a big thing. The way that women retain water is going to be a little differently than men. So kind of keep that in mind. The other thing that's really, really super important, if you're coming from a low carbohydrate or low calorie background, right, and you're just starting to introduce carbohydrates, basically, carbs need 4 parts water to process carbohydrates, right? And that will ultimately, if you haven't had a lot of carbohydrates, your cells are essentially inflexible to metabolizing carbohydrates. And so in the beginning, you will struggle a little bit more than you will once you start to use this food to fuel better exercise. So the suggestion that we often make for a lot of newer folks is load most of your carbohydrates post-workout, because your body is most sensitive at that point and will actually absorb them better. What I think happens for a lot of people, and I'm not saying that you, viewer who's watching this right now, but I'm saying for some people, they've kind of eaten in a restricted way for a while. They come to Eat to Perform, they see that top number, and boom, they want to move into eating like a normal human being right off the bat. And they'd be much better off following the graduated plan that we give them, because without that, they're going to gain a little bit more weight. And truthfully, all we're trying to do is give them a basic guideline. So a lot of times the guideline ends up being 6 to 10 weeks, something like that, where we're kind of reversing them out of kind of this low calorie, low carb way of eating. And some people are actually low fat too. So it just sort of depends on what like your flavor was, as it relates to restriction. Am I missing anything here, April?
I think that's the ride or die mentality. That if they don't hurry up and ride it, then they're never going to make it. So some people just jump in head first.
Yeah, and I mean, look, if you're okay with a little weight gain, we're okay with you jumping in head first. But like, I think what ends up happening is they're like, well, I'm okay with a little weight gain. And they're thinking like 2 pounds and not realizing that if you were eating 1,300 calories, you don't have a lot of, metabolic capacity. You're not a great athlete yet. You will ultimately gain 3 to 5 pounds very quickly. And, I think that that's a quick way to scare the heck out of yourself, and it's not necessary, right? And so now, is 6 to 10 weeks, is that the end all be all for everyone? Well, no, it's not. It's really sort of an estimate, but what we've found is that, as people start to add food and really start to push, the strength numbers, the hypertrophy work, and then of course some of the other things we're going to talk about here in a second, that their body adjusts. So let's say that you are gradually moving up, okay, but you're not really pushing the work side of things, you're going to struggle, right? You're not going to get the kind of result somebody that's actually pushing themselves. And that's one of the reasons why, we have so many people showing their PRs and all this other type of stuff. And the reason why we made that a priority, with Eat to Perform, because we want people to understand that work helps this process a lot. And so, so keep that in mind. The other part of the bloating brings me to endurance, okay? And, I sort of get teased about the long endurance thing. And I've always had endurance as a component, all 7, 8 years, right? There's never been a time where I haven't had endurance as a component. But a lot of it was similar to what I'm going to talk about last, which is high intensity training, okay? The reason why I like low intensity work and then sometimes long endurance, which is more like tempo, running or something like that. The good majority of the time, I like people to have some level of walking, trying to get, their activity up. That way they can eat a little bit more flexibly. Their body starts responding, on a cellular level, to the, the new foods, the new approach to eating, and things of that nature. What I'm talking about with long endurance, though, I do 1 day a week. And I think the problem with doing multiple days a week is, once again, you sort of get good at that one thing, And so I will run through how my week looks like. And then, once we're at the end of all this. But when I first started doing long endurance, I started basically, running like a 5K. And so I'd run a 5K, and it was kind of a slower 5K because, I really wasn't adjusted to running. I wasn't trying to do it for time or anything like that. And so I would say, let's just say 45 minutes. Okay. I don't remember what it was. It was probably between 30 and 45 minutes. As I gradually started moving, I wasn't necessarily looking for pacing as much as I was looking for volume. And so from that, 30 to 45 minutes, I moved into an hour, and then I started adding in elements. And one of the reasons why I like adding in elements like airdyne or rowing or stair steppers or ellipticals is because a lot of those things, ski erg's another good one, a lot of those things don't have the impact on your body the way that running does, okay? Now, if you want to get better at running, you're going to have to run some because you have to prepare your body for that beating. And that's one of the reasons why I've talked about some of the running that I've done. So to give you an example, because I want to get back to the bloating thing because it comes up a lot, right? Last Friday, I ran a half marathon. I think my calories burned for that day were somewhere in the 4,200 range. I think I ate somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 calories. I was absolutely not bloated the next day. Why? Because not only did my body need that amount of nutrients plus, right, but my body actually used those nutrients. See, that's the big issue with bloating. Okay, and if you really wanted to break it down and go, well, why do I feel bloated? Well, part of why you feel bloated is because you're not doing enough, or what you're doing is not stressful enough for the amount of food that you're eating, right? So what you're trying to do is take food that's sitting on the outside of your cell. That's essentially what bloating is. It's water, right? So the bloating that's sitting on the outside of your cell, between running, between weightlifting, something of that nature, you're trying to do something stressful enough to take that water from outside the cell and bring it into the cell so your body can use it for better work capacity later on. I think that's probably the best way that I can explain that. But when you say to yourself, well, but I, feel bloated today, but it's a rest day. Don't sweat it. Tomorrow's a workout day. Or, being bloated for a day or two is no big deal. In fact, I will intentionally bloat myself, going into Thursday. And if I push it, and on Friday during the day, I feel a little watery and a little slushy, I know that, well, I probably don't need to eat 5,000-6,000 calories that night, for one, but my body will soak that up when I start to go into my workouts. And so, like this week, I'll do 45 minutes airdyne, 45 minutes of rowing. I'm not suggesting that people need to do this amount of long endurance. What I am suggesting, though, is that they should have some long endurance for themselves, right? So if you're constantly, doing a workout in like the 1 hour range, I'm just making an argument for a hike on Sunday with your family for 2 hours, right? And that extra, the extra amount of calories that you're going to be doing is actually going to help as it relates to the stimulus. The other thing that often doesn't get factored into this scenario is that when you are hiking and you're going up and down hills, okay, it's working a very different energy system than when you are trying to lift heavy, and I'll walk you through how you want to do that. But, in a sense, okay, it almost works like a rest day. And this would be one of the arguments for running too often, for doing 15-minute WODs too often. Even if you're like switching out sit-ups, your body sort of adjusts to 15-minute workouts, even at relatively high intensity, right? And so the key to this whole thing is to go, as long as you can, fit in something that's challenging, right? So let's say that I get to a point where my workouts are 4 hours, right, with long endurance. At that point, I'll start working on pace, right? And I'll start working on how to make the stimulus more effective in the amount of time that I have available. So keep that in mind. Don't look at what I'm saying that I do and go, okay, I'm going to do what Paul does, right? I want you to look at what you do and how you can structure your workouts so you can get a result, because that's really the problem that most people face. Is they do too much running, too much weightlifting, and there's just not enough bang for the buck. When I was training powerlifting, as an example, and working up my 1 rep max to close to 500, lifted 474, had 500 pounds in my hands many times, whether it be like rack pulls, something of this nature. But the problem is I didn't have enough long endurance at that point. I was still doing WODs, which was fine, but there just wasn't enough work, and if I had long endurance in that mix, yeah, I probably couldn't have got as strong. That's kind of debatable, actually. I sort of think I could, just because of the way that I understand recovery. I don't know that I would get as strong at deadlift, squat, and bench, but I think if I could pick 2 of those, I could definitely get as strong, right? Because the amount of recovery involved, but I just cannot emphasize enough how much that long endurance allows for a lot of work. And so when you look at the 3 hours, a lot of people work out 3 days a week. I work out 3 days a week in that one day. That's the value of added work, right? And that's the value of thinking, smarter rather than harder, right? And so that's what I want you guys to consider when we're talking about getting a result for what you're looking to do. Okay. Anything closing? I know you started to run a little bit, April.
I just want to add in. I just want to add in that with the increased endurance, that they do need to make sure that they are increasing their food. Because a lot of people are probably watching and they're like, this sounds great. Oh, I'm going to try that. I'm going to increase it. But then they don't want to increase their food, which is just going to cause a lot of added stress.
Yeah, and I can tell you that I'm still figuring out that food part. I know that, for myself, I probably need to add a little bit more food earlier in the day, because what's happening is I'm eating a lot of food after it, because obviously I'm hungry. And, sometimes that'll, cause me to wake up a little bit earlier, something of that nature. So I'm still sort of figuring out that part. But when you're doing 4,000, 5,000 calories worth of work, I'm serious with you guys. You got a plan, and chicken and kale ain't going to get you there. And you think that, well, it's no big deal. No, it's a real big deal, right? Because, that food, I'll just straight up tell you, when I ran that half marathon, I was like, I came home, I was like in the fetal position. And the only thing that I could think of was to have a pizza delivered, right? So, I mean, I was ready to cut off my legs. My body hurt so much, and now I'm starting to realize that I was going up a lot of hills at that point that I really wasn't considering at that time. Um, but once I had, the pizza in me, once I had a little ice cream in me, all of a sudden my body started to like soak it up, and the pain started to go away a little bit. Now I was still hurting a little bit, no, for a couple days, but without that food, the amount of recovery. I mean, I was able to recover within hours, right? I mean, like literally the amount of energy that I had within hours was dramatically changed by the amount of food that I was able to eat at that time. And so, the one thing that you really want to factor in here is this is the time to do date night. This is the time to eat more flexibly, right? And I think that some people struggle on the weekends where they want to eat a little bit more flexibly. That's a great time to add in 2-hour hiking, you know what I mean, with your family and things of that nature. It's a real benefit. So in terms of, we're already kind of going a little long. I can wrap this up pretty easily, but I want to make sure that we do the high intensity component good, right? So what is high intensity? Okay, so a lot of people think that CrossFit is high intensity. By my definition, CrossFit is not high intensity. And I was doing high intensity work way before CrossFit. High intensity is basically, the best way to view it is Tabata protocol, right? And so I'm gonna use two examples of what real high intensity is. I'm not being dismissive of CrossFit here, and I'll show you that in just a second. A Tabata is basically 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off. Okay, 20 seconds is all out. Okay, you cannot do a kettlebell swing all out. You cannot do a sumo deadlift high pull all out. You will naturally rest more. So you can really only do like the Tabata protocol, right? The other thing you can't do with the Tabata protocol is make it 16 minutes, right? That's not the Tabata protocol. You'll naturally rest as the even if you were thinking, oh, this is going to be 16 minutes long, you're going to naturally rest more. So I'm just trying to give you guys a framework on how to view high intensity work so you can sort of structure it. But it's all useful, right? Everything that I'm talking about is work. And so the more work you can do, the better that is. So that's a good thing, right? So just remember, Tabata protocol, the best two examples would be running on a treadmill, would be airdyne work. Anything other than that, like for instance, you can't row a Tabata protocol. I mean, certainly you can row for 20 seconds on and 10 seconds on, but that's not a Tabata, okay? The other thing that I would argue is really, really good for you would be something like hill sprints. Now, I'll tell you, similar to the Tabata protocol, it should kick your ass. I mean, like it should really, really hurt, almost to like the puke stage, right? So essentially what I would do when I would do hill sprints is I would run up the hill, I'd walk down the hill, and then I'd run back up the hill and then walk down the hill. And that was basically the best way to kind of guarantee the high intensity part. But really you have to kind of push it. You can't just like jog up the hill because that's the high intensity. The thing that a hill does is you can sort of overrun your ability and then end up hurting yourself, popping a hamstring, things of this nature. That's very hard to do with a hill sprint because the hill sprint acts as some level of resistance that actually protects you. And so I would say when you're looking for maximum high intensity, right, those would be the two examples. Could you go to a 6-minute Tabata protocol? You could, and maybe you have the athletic ability to do that. I would still argue that you could potentially overdo it a little bit, right? Now, I know that there are a few people that may or may not be asking questions, but frankly, at this point, we're not going to be able to answer those questions because we're already at 8 o'clock and I haven't really kind of finished even the high intensity part, though I'm going to be pretty close. So let's talk about high intensity circuits or high-ish intensity circuits. That's what CrossFit would be, right? Where you take 3 to 4 elements and then you do it at a relatively high heart rate, okay? So one of the things that people always talk about is don't go above your red zone. That's an interesting kind of line in the sand, because I would argue that with the Tabata protocol, you're actually trying to go over your red line, right? Your red line in this instance, I think would be the best way to explain it would be, can you talk, right? If you're doing a Tabata protocol, you shouldn't be able to talk, right? Because you will be breathing too heavy in the rest intervals. So when we talk about, do you want to get to a red line? I think the can you talk guide is a fairly decent guide. And I would agree that if you're doing something like, CrossFit as an example, the best way to do it is to kind of push that top in, but still be pacing it in a way that's going to allow you to improve. When most people start CrossFit, okay, what happens, similar to what we were talking about with weightlifting, is their ego's not involved, right? And so what ends up happening is their ego's not involved, so they start relatively conservatively. They're using bands, they're doing all these different things that allow them to sort of protect themselves. And then what ends up happening is they start to build some capacity, they start to build some strength, and they sort of push it, which is a good thing, right? You want to push things to the point where you're seeing progress. The problem with that is you earn, and I may actually lose the folks on Periscope. I apologize for that. My battery is going a little bit low. But what a WOD is a WOD is a test of the amount of strength endurance, and the amount of skill that you've earned, right? And so one of the reasons why everybody improves so much in the beginning is because there's not a lot of ego involved. Instead of trying to do double unders, they're doing singles, so they can whip through singles really quickly. But then once they start to RX WODs and things of this nature, they can kind of, just gradually do double unders one at a time, and then all of a sudden they have like a double under workout. It sort of defeats the purpose of why you're working out with kind of a slowish circuit. And so one of the things that Chris Spieler said in my level 1, because I am a level 1 certified. Well, actually, I might not be, because it's been something like 4 years. I don't know when you have to renew it. I'm probably not going to renew it no matter what. But Chris Spieler said, I'm just not going to renew it because I don't coach CrossFit. So, what Chris Spieler said was that the best athletes in the gym should finish around the same time as the athletes that are aspiring to be the best athletes in the gym. And that's the way that you get better, right? And so what I think happens is somebody sees a WOD on the board and they RX that WOD. And then the next day they see something and they kind of can do those things. And so they push it a little further. And then all of a sudden, RXing WODs becomes more important than getting better as an athlete. And being 4 years into my journey, I can tell you that I almost never RX a WOD, because the whole point of a WOD for myself, and I'll WOD, typically 2 times a week, is I'm trying to be the best athlete that I can be there, right? And so if, as an example, toes to bar would be something that I'm not great at. And so if there's a lot of toes to bar in a workout, I'll do knees to chest, because I don't want toes to bar to dominate that workout. And so I won't get the benefit that, I would get from becoming better as an athlete by, doing it, getting enough volume in the workout. And then you go, well, then how do you get better at toes to bar? Well, you work on toes to bar as a skill outside of the workout. That's why I said WODs are a test, right? And so is there anything that I'm sort of missing there? I mean, I feel like some people will feel like I'm being dismissive of CrossFit, that it's not high intensity. But if you look at, like Chris Spieler's saying, when you work out, it should look like kind of a version of the people that do the CrossFit Games, right? Where the speed and intensity should be the same, just you've modified the weight or you've modified the skill to your ability. So there's no disrespecting of CrossFit. I'm just saying that what got us good, relatively quickly, we abandoned in an effort to try and RX WODs, and it sort of hurt our athletic ability. Does that make sense?
It kind of makes sense. Am I
You're echoing a little bit.
I'm echoing quite a bit. I think it makes perfect sense, like what you were saying. If you can't do toes to bar, if you're going to attempt to RX it and it's going to take you longer and you're going to end up spending more time and only getting, so many reps on that, rather than continuing to keep your pace up and do something that you're good at, like what you said, work on the toes to bar at home or, in your skill time, exactly.
Or get stronger, right?
Absolutely.
Get stronger, work on your toes to bar outside of that. We can talk about, do you have mobility issues or do you have strength issues? And I would argue a lot of people that think that they have mobility issues think that they actually have strength issues. Because I've spent thousands of dollars personally researching that. And as I've gotten stronger, magically, I've gotten more mobile. Okay, so how do you put this all together? So I want to end with the high intensity portion, or the high-ish intensity portion when we're doing WODs, where the high-ish intensity, you really want to pace it. You want to get in enough volume where you're getting in a good workout. Don't get stuck on one element, because ultimately that, you're failing that test, just because you're, able to RX that WOD, really what you want to get in is a lot of volume. So the how do you put it all together? Okay, so essentially what you want to do is, I'll give you an example, of how I do it. So Tuesday is basically a heavy day for me. All right, and so even though I'm kind of in more of a hypertrophy phase at this moment, like I said, I'm still doing 10 reps at 315 pounds or whatever, right? So it's still kind of heavy, So on Tuesday, I might do, my heavy deadlifts. I'm going to do maybe some level of rows at, and I'm assuming that in this instance, most people would have an hour. So I'm going to work them through an hour. And so, so I'll work through my heavy deadlift progression. Like I said, right now I'm doing 10-8-5. I recently was doing 3-2-1. And so I'll move to something like higher rep rows at that point. And so maybe I'll do, 100 rows, with what, about 105 pounds, something of that nature. And so, I'll basically take those 100 rows, and then I'll try and do them as quickly as I can. And what that allows for is less rest and more muscle activation. Okay, and then I will finish that with a 4-minute Tabata protocol. Okay, once again, I'm not trying to say this is what you guys should do, write all this stuff down and do it, and then you'll get ripped. What I'm saying is this is what I do, this is what works for me, and I would like you to consider what works for me and how you could incorporate that into your routine and potentially get better as an athlete. So for 4 minutes, I'll do a Tabata protocol with Airdyne, okay? So on Wednesday, I will do mostly upper body hypertrophy work. And so similar to the deadlifts, I'll do something like bench press or overhead press. Try to get to a higher number. And so let's say that for bench press, I'll get to something like 180 for 3. Okay. And so I'll work up essentially sets of 3 up to 180, and then I'll start coming down, right? And then basically at about 115, once again, I will do something like burnout sets or myo reps where it sort of depends on time, where I'm really looking for high muscle activation to get in some level of hypertrophy work. Sometimes I will work in sets where I will start doing chin-ups at 3s and 5s, okay? Usually at 3s and 5s, I'm going to put some weight on those chin-ups. So I might have like a 45-pound plate, and I'm doing sets of 3 to try and get muscle activation. So once I start moving to 115 times 20 to get to 100 or myo reps, or really trying to get to high-end rep ranges, I then move from chin-ups to something like kipping pull-ups, where I can do 20 kipping pull-ups to get like high level of lat activation. Sometimes that can get a little stressful, on the days where I did rows before and stuff like that. So I kind of keep that in mind. And then if 20 seems like too much, maybe 15 is okay, maybe 10 is okay. But in general, what I'm trying to do is get enough stimulation there to get some enough tissue torn down, so I get kind of that pump that we were talking about earlier. Then if I have enough time, I will, and I wasn't doing overhead press, I will do something like handstand push-up strict, to where I am trying to get some level of overhead work in. And so I'm not really focusing on legs on that day, because obviously I did that the previous day. Thursday is a rest day. Normally I do walk on a rest day. I typically walk, it's just kind of a longer walk with my dog. It's about 4 miles. I usually burn 500 to 550 calories, and so it allows me to eat a little bit more flexibly and allows me to go into Friday kind of loaded up and ready to go. So on Friday, as an example, and sometimes when I'm on hypertrophy work, you'll see that my high intensity work's not near as much, right? A lot of the times when I'm not focused on hypertrophy, Wednesday will be a WOD day. And so Thursday's a rest day. Friday is a long endurance day. Like I said last week, 9.5 miles, 30-minute Airdyne, 25-minute. Biggest food day by far, usually 4,000 to 5,000 calories, which is interesting because a lot of people that do long endurance, that are runners and things of this nature, they do not eat on the days that they run. And they are essentially trying to use their running to burn fat. And I'm suggesting that they would be better off having a better approach throughout the week. And we'll talk about that in the upcoming weeks. So on my long endurance day, Saturday, as an example, is a rest day. I do typically go for longer walks with my wife, and so I might, burn somewhere in the neighborhood of 550 to 750 calories. A hike is it's not stressful at all. But I'll always have like some level of walking. Even some of these days that I'm working out, I like to get away from the computer. I like to get in nature, and I like to have less stress. And that's what walking does for me, right? Um, so Saturday is a rest-ish day. Sunday is a big hypertrophy work day. Once again, Wednesdays and Sundays are sort of optional for me and might be for you as well, right? Because, you might prefer to WOD in those scenarios, or you might already have a lot of muscle. I just don't have as much muscle as you do. So on those days, I do hypertrophy work. So as an example, I'll do, hip thrusters. I will do ab wheel work. I will do lunges. And then I do typically throw in something like push-ups because, my upper body, your upper body typically can handle a little bit more work than, um, certain areas. Like as an example, my abs, like doing the ab wheel, if I do ab wheel more than once a week, I'm probably prone to ab strains in that scenario, right? And okay, so let's break it down. So then Monday's a rest day. Okay, so that now let's go, well, what would you really do? Okay, on Tuesday's my heavy day, on Friday's my long endurance day. I want them as far away from each other as possible. When we look at the muscle fibers that are used for heavy lifting, and then the Tabata protocol, they're very similar, right? Fast twitch muscle, very active, athletic type movements. Then, we're looking at kind of similar type stuff, but working a different body part on Wednesday. And then, of course, on Friday, we're working a completely different energy system. We're really wanting our muscles breathing and things of this nature, trying to get oxygen through those muscles and really kind of keeping the tempo at somewhere in the neighborhood of about 125 to 145. Sometimes my heart rate will get up to 160. That's not that bad of a deal. Either. It just depends on how good you are as an athlete, sometimes how young you are, things of that nature. Sunday, like I said, I kind of consider more of a potpourri day. If, for instance, next Sunday, I'm not feeling up for the hypertrophy work, maybe I would end up doing WOD. Honestly, I don't think I will, because I'm about getting better at this point. And for me to get better, I talked a little bit about just because you can lift more weight does not always correlate to being stronger. And that the flip is also true, right? Just because you have bigger muscles doesn't necessarily mean that, you'll necessarily lift more weight. But I can say, if my glutes don't get bigger, if my quads don't get bigger, if my lats don't get bigger, I'm not going to be able to deadlift 550 pounds, right? So I have to work on some level of hypertrophy work. And what's interesting, working with even CrossFit athletes or Olympians and stuff like this, all these folks have some of this work programmed in, because you have to maintain and potentially build to get to that next level in terms of athleticism. And the argument that we're making is the athleticism is what's important, right? We know, because you're here, that less didn't work for you. And so we're making the argument that if you can pursue more, that's really the end game. And that's why this is the second part of getting started, right? Because we want you guys to understand how to improve. Many of you are coming here after doing 2 years of CrossFit, or after powerlifting for 5 years, or after running, 15 triathlons, right? And so you're trying to get better, and this, if you look at these things as various buckets, and we'll shut it down here because April's looking like she needs to go to bed, but let's view CrossFit as a bucket, let's view long endurance as a bucket, and let's use strength training as a bucket. Okay, if I were training for a CrossFit competition as an example, I might push things more to that bucket. If I'm going to a weightlifting competition and I know that I'm training for that, I'll have more hypertrophy and weightlifting in that bucket. Okay, so I'll focus a little bit more on that. If I was going for a marathon as an example, I might emphasize a day more running, something in that nature, right? So we're going to emphasize the different buckets at various times. I will say that I have borrowed very heavily from the Hybrid Athlete, which was a book from, it's actually by Juggernaut Publishing, from Alex Vieta. You know, we have a video for Alex. You know, we post it all the time. It's very interesting. And, you know, I would say that the most progress that I've made, you know, in terms of body composition, in terms of getting better as an athlete, was after listening to Alex speak. I was already kind of heading down that path, but he put the final pieces of the puzzle together for me. And so, like I said, you might want to get good at CrossFit. You might want to get good at triathlons. You might want to get good at weightlifting. What I'm saying is that you should have a piece of all of it in place so your whole athletic profile is put together well. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. Sorry we couldn't get into questions. Obviously this went very, very long. I think we did a pretty good job of covering. What do you think, April? How did we do?
I agree. It was awesome.
All right. Well, we're going to head off here, and then we're going to post this in the forum so you guys can, you know, if you had to head out or you only caught part of it, this will give you the opportunity to check it out later on. So I appreciate everybody being here. Also, for the people that were watching on Periscope or whatever, maybe we'll just go ahead and post it to the main Facebook page just in this one instance, because I think this is a good one for people to see. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.
Good night.
All right.